Today I want to cover two different timelines about the potential of Teddy Roosevelt winning the election of 1912. As you might be aware, a common take on this puts a lot of the pains of World War I, as well as some of the issues of American politics to this very day, on President Wilson, who historically won this election. In this view, it is argued that had Teddy instead won, he would have rallied the Americans to war earlier, ensuring millions of American boys flood the European battlefields, allowing the West to force the Germans into surrender. Plausibly, even ensuring the Russian Empire survives the war, thereby avoiding the horrors of Soviet communism. And, due to the shorter war and more lenient peace deal in Germany, also hopefully avoiding the rise of ultranationalism and the horrors of World War II. Today, we are going to do two things. We are going to follow an optimistic version of this timeline, which indeed has earlier American participation, but I am going to put some asterisks on how much of a difference this might make. I don't want to directly reject the timeline I described earlier, but I do want to highlight some aspects which might make it less likely than hoped. Secondly, I want to explore a pessimistic take on such a timeline. We don't have exact polling numbers or figures, but it is safe to say that generally the American public was very isolationist, and that was a constant amongst both political parties, Republican and Democrat. So, what if Roosevelt got the nation into the war prematurely, and as hundreds of thousands of Americans lose their lives before the 1916 election, we may come to a timeline where Teddy's intervention completely backfires in the long term. But first, we need to discuss how to even make this happen. How does Roosevelt win an election wherein Wilson historically got over 80% of the electoral votes? Well, ever since 1896, the Republicans had won 4 presidential elections in a row, and with rather impressive margins at that. In 1896 and 1900, the Republican nominee had been William McKinley, who thus won 2 terms in office, yet he was assassinated only 6 months into his second term. His vice president, Roosevelt, would succeed him. Now within the Republican Party, there were generally 2 wings. The progressives, who championed things like worker reforms, social programs, women's suffrage and political reform. On the other side were the conservatives, who were more pro-big business, less government intervention and economic protectionism. Within this divide, McKinley was more towards the conservative side, while Roosevelt was chosen as the VP to satisfy the progressives. Now president, Roosevelt initially continued McKinley's agenda, before handily winning a second term in 1904. In this second term, he put in practice more of his progressive agenda, busting monopolies within the nation and greatly increasing his popularity in the process. Then, in 1908, having served 2 terms, he stepped aside, respecting Washington's 2-term convention. He personally endorsed William Howard Taft as his successor, who also easily won his election. But during Taft's presidency, a rift began to grow between the 2 men. Roosevelt grew yet more progressive, while Taft was drifting further right. Divisions between the party began to grow, personified by these 2 presidents, eventually resulting in Roosevelt directly challenging Taft for the Republican nomination in 1912. Now for the first time, more liberal states had begun holding primaries, in which the people could directly vote for their preferred candidate, in which Roosevelt handily defeated Taft. Yet, in the majority of states, this was not yet the case, and it was up to the state conventions themselves to decide who to support. These more conservative state conventions decisively swung Taft. The race got increasingly nasty, with Roosevelt rejecting a compromise candidate and accusing Taft of rigging the delegations against him. A specific issue of contention was that the southern states, who hadn't voted for Republicans in about 4 decades, accounted for 25% of the delegations to win the nomination, and these overwhelmingly went to Taft. When it became clear that Taft would win the nomination, Roosevelt and many of his supporters just walked out, forming the Bull Moose Progressive Party to stand as a third-party candidate. This would split the Republican vote, allowing Wilson to easily win with only 42% of the popular vote. Second was Roosevelt with his new party, who outperformed Taft's Republicans. So, with the Republicans having defeated each other, the first Democrat in 16 years took up the White House at this crucial time. So, the route to a Roosevelt victory seems relatively straightforward. Let him win the Republican nomination. In a three-way race, it is near impossible for either of the Republicans to win. Still, unifying the party is more difficult than it looks. He was challenging the incumbent president with a unified party wing behind him. Another issue was that Roosevelt was breaking the two-term convention, and even fellow progressives like La Follette refused to support his new party. Thus, the manner in which he wins could also matter, as if he completely alienates the conservative wing, it is not unthinkable that Wilson might still have a shot at the presidency, or at the very least, Roosevelt's control over the House and the Senate might be very limited. It is commonly accepted that either Taft or Roosevelt running a unified ticket would sweep Wilson, but this is not necessarily the case. Wilson himself was a progressive Democrat, and especially against Taft, he could win a lot of voters, which historically went to Roosevelt. Roosevelt does easily have the better shot, and I would put my money on him, but losing the conservative wing could still cost him a lot of votes, especially if some progressives are also unhappy about his third term and protest vote for the socialists or Wilson. But of course, it's hardly unrealistic to say that Teddy, with a relatively united Republican Party behind him, would relatively handily win this election. Wilson would still put up the best Democratic performance since Cleveland in 1892, but it wouldn't be close to enough. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now, the first couple of years of his presidency wouldn't be that unique. He would pursue his progressive reforms, like advocating for national health care, implementing a federal income tax. Yes, I'm sorry Wilson haters, Roosevelt wanted that too. Women's suffrage, open primaries for presidential nominations, and general market regulations. Those types of policies are what most of his efforts are initially aimed at, and his success will come down to how large his majorities are in the House and the Senate, but also what the balance between progressives and conservative Republicans are in the legislature. It is very likely a lot of compromises will be required, both within the Republican Party, but potentially also reaching across the aisle to progressive Democrats. Obviously, his overall success will depend on the House and the Senate. Historically, the Republicans did terrible in 1912, but of course, this was with the bull moose progressives splitting the vote. The specifics are way too complicated to predict, but it's likely the Republicans win a narrow to comfortable House majority, while about 6 Senate seats were historically spoiled by the progressives and may now become Republican. If only 4 of those seats are flipped, this would be enough for a slim Senate majority. All in all, the Republicans likely hold a trifecta in government, but Roosevelt will still wrestle to secure enough votes for his major progressive legislation across his presidency. But of course, by 1914, his presidency will be forced to redirect largely to foreign policy. This is for 2 reasons. First, the start of World War I, but second, partially because of war in Europe, 1914 had seen an economic crisis, which very likely means the Democrats regain control over the House, so pursuing domestic politics becomes significantly more difficult. So the president likely starts focusing on the World War, where he was staunch in his dislike for Germany, but he was also known as a peacemaker, having negotiated an end to the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. In regards to his attempts to restore peace, it is highly unlikely Roosevelt achieves major success. President Wilson had in our timeline also attempted to broker peace in Europe, but the issue was that Germany was in a strong position at the start. Any peace deal Berlin would accept requires concessions, at the very least from Russia, and likely an end to Serbian independence as well. Of course, such a peace would in turn be unacceptable to the Entente powers, and I highly doubt Roosevelt himself would be interested either. Roosevelt would, likely sooner than Wilson, realize a negotiated peace was not happening, and at least put into public conscience the first hints of intervention. Yet, even somebody as grand as Roosevelt cannot just get the US into a war. It was the legislature, not the executive, which declared wars, and even with a Republican majority, Teddy would need to contend with opposition from within his own party. And after the November election, the Democrats would make it even more difficult. Teddy would start the war hamstrung, unable to do anything beyond minor support for the Entente. Luckily for him though, the Germans would soon make his efforts to join easier. Things like unrestricted submarine warfare and the sinking of the Lusitania could be used by Roosevelt to at least start stoking anti-German sentiment. Now what I often see in Teddy 1912 scenarios is the US joining in 1950, spurred on by the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a British commercial ship with American citizens on board. This interpretation is not without merit. When this event happened in our timeline, Wilson had taken a diplomatic approach, demanding from Germany recompense and an end to unrestricted submarine warfare, even threatening war if Germany did continue. Germany, in return, reined in their submarines for years. Roosevelt, on the sidelines, was furious and demanded of Wilson a far stronger military response to defend America's honor on the world stage. It is easily argued that, had he been president, he would have tried to escalate the conflict, potentially even walking the US into a conflict in 1915. Yet, I have two problems with this. First, again, I don't think he could have done this. Second, I don't think he should have done it. I will argue that, possibly, entering the war this early on could become an outright disaster for the US and the world at large. I will elaborate on this point later, as it forms the basis of my pessimistic timeline. So first, could Roosevelt join the war after the Lusitania? It's unlikely. While the sinking of the ship was a shock, and anti-German sentiment rose, and some action was demanded of the government, jumping to joining the land war in Europe is quite the leap. Again, it is highly unlikely Congress will sign off on war by this stage. More importantly, we must not forget that Germany is an independent actor in this timeline. Even if Roosevelt tries to escalate within the bounds of his authority, not necessarily by declaring war, but with a show of force and demands of Germany, perhaps even going as far as shooting at German submarines, Germany, much like in our timeline, could realize the danger of American entry into the war and make concessions to the Americans. Once Germany makes such concessions and stops their submarine warfare, what justification does Roosevelt still have for war? Thus, this is where I will split the timeline in two. In the pessimistic timeline, Roosevelt rushes the war shortly after the Lusitania somehow, thereby entering the war a full 2 years earlier, which undoubtedly has the potential to swing the balance of power. But in the process, the war declaration is controversial, and the US enters the war as a divided nation, with many Democrats and Republicans united in their opposition to the conflict, where the alternate election of 1916 may well decide the fate of the world. The second timeline I will sketch, I judge to be more optimistic. In that, the Lusitania is merely the start of a White House campaign to increase support for intervention, but it is not when Roosevelt pulls the trigger. Instead, he waits for about a year longer, where he finds what might be the casus belli of this alternate timeline. In July of 1916, pro-German agents had exploded US munitions on US soil, said to be shipped to the Entente. If Roosevelt can show, or at least convince the nation of German involvement, this could be a great moment to argue the threat that Germany poses to the US and the international order and start preparing for full intervention. In such a case, the US still enters the war about a year earlier than historically, but more united behind the cause, and, as I will soon elaborate on, with less risk of the 1916 election ruining everything. So let's start with the pessimistic timeline. Despite all of my prior objections, it turns out that I am wrong. Roosevelt does indeed manage to rally the nation around something like Lusitania and narrowly manages to mobilize the nation into war. Already halfway through 1915, America starts preparing their soldiers, intervening in the naval conflict directly, and assisting in the blockade of Germany in Europe. While it will take roughly a year before American troops start seriously arriving in Europe, the effect is immediate. The Entente are jubilant, celebrating both the near arrival of reinforcements, which will negate the German advantage on the Western Front, as well as the opening up of American cash for the war effort, ensuring that they will not have to cannibalize their own economies to pay for this war effort. Beyond that, morale amongst the Central Powers declines significantly, as even with successes in Eastern Europe, it becomes more difficult to see a pathway to victory for the Germans. Now here, before I actually dive into my pessimistic timeline, there is a low but non-zero chance that the Central Powers do surrender after Roosevelt's intervention. While I don't think it is likely, it is worth discussing. With the odds now so stacked against them, the Germans might reach out for a peace conference, and Roosevelt indeed gets to lead it in 1915. In such a case, we do enter a potentially very interesting timeline. We might see minor border changes like Alsace to France, Bosnia to Serbia, and other minor movements, but with peace restored, nothing fundamental has been solved. Still, even while shorter, the devastation of the war is still clear, and it is unlikely a new one happens in the short term. Specifically, Britain and the USA will celebrate their great success in this short but decisive intervention on the continent. France, having reclaimed Alsace, begins building fortifications in case of a new war, while losing much of their interest in the Russian alliance. Russia themselves, humiliated militarily but victorious politically, might have a few more years before liberal or socialist revolutions rock the state. Austria-Hungary, after their defeat, likely sees the Hungarians and potentially other groups start stoking unrest, and they may well soon lose their status as a great power. Even if the Germans retain their ambitions, this could very well leave them without any great power allies. The very fundament of European geopolitics as we knew them before the war could be gone, as the instability of Eastern European empires like Austria-Hungary, Russia and the Ottomans will likely decide the future of the entire continent. But that is assuming the Germans surrender, which again, I don't. Rather, I might imagine that German leadership sets their mind on a crucial moment in the near future: the alternate election of 1916. This election is, in essence, my main fear with such an early American intervention. In our timeline, Wilson in 1916 had campaigned on peace, on keeping the US out of the war. Yet in April, just a few months into his second term, he joined anyways. He could do this, absorb this political cost, arguably because the election was already over. And of course, the German Zimmermann telegram and their resumption of submarine warfare helped a lot too. But for Wilson, it was at least a year and a half out from the new midterms, and 3.5 years until a new presidential election. By that time, the US would either be entrenched in the war, or the war would practically be over anyways. Even still, famously, we did see the Democrats lose the 1918 midterms, which would weaken Wilson's position at Versailles and undermine his League of Nations. So, in my view, entering the war in 1915 opens up Roosevelt to a lot of risk. Yes, he had a lot of personal popularity, but that doesn't mean he is guaranteed to win any election. It is rather plausible that the Democrats try to turn the election into a practical referendum on the continuation of the war. Beyond that, if Roosevelt chooses to run again, it would be for a fourth term. Fear-mongering about American dictatorship would be dialed up even further, with potential for challenges from within the Republican Party against the president, including a Republican anti-war movement potentially declining to vote, or protest voting for the Democrats. The electoral cycle would be dominated with attacks on Roosevelt as a tyrant and a warmonger, and it remains to be seen if his personal popularity would be strong enough to stand up to that. It is for this reason I think the Black Tom explosion is so much better as a starting point for the war. It would be way easier to paint this as a direct attack to American soil from Germany than the Lusitania one, especially after Germany attempts to reconcile with the US. If the reason for the war is not enough to convince the American public, a Democratic victory in 1916 becomes very plausible. Adding to this is that Roosevelt likely overpromises to the American people, saying that all they might need is a strong show of force to convince the Germans that the war is unwinnable and peace will be restored. But if that doesn't happen, and after an initial period of mobilization, with Germany not surrendering, American soldiers will actually start entering the trenches. In just 5 months of fighting historically, the US had 300,000 casualties. If, by the time of this alternate 1916 election, Roosevelt hadn't yet ensured peace in Europe, but instead caused hundreds of thousands of wounded and dead American boys, his defeat in this election becomes yet more likely. All of this would be far less of a problem with Black Tom, because by the time of the elections, American intervention will still be in the mobilization stage and on the naval front. The actual horrors of trench warfare won't yet shell-shock the Americans until after the election. But then you may wonder, even if Germany doesn't surrender, wouldn't the additional forces allow for a collapse of the Western Front? Well, maybe. But again, it will take about a year before the Americans actually start fighting in Europe in large number, by which point the Germans had already broken through Russia and Serbia was already pacified. Germany would likely need to weaken their eastern front to reinforce the west, but not to such an extent the Russians are going to decisively push Germany back. Another issue caused by the early Roosevelt intervention is that Germany never stops their submarine warfare. After all, they only did that to keep the US out of the war. While not a game changer, this would make the war at least a bit more uncomfortable for the Western Entente. So let's stop beating around the bush. The 1916 election. Likely either Roosevelt or a chosen successor committed to the war against a Democrat. Woodrow Wilson might get the nomination again, or else it could be an anti-war figure like Champ Clark. Either of these figures, and any dark horse candidate, would oppose American involvement in Europe, or at least campaign on ending the war sooner rather than later, regardless of whether Germany surrenders. Potentially, something like what Wilson in our own timeline called for is pursued. A compromise peace deal, a peace without victory. Which, with the front lines as they were in 1916, would undoubtedly mean concessions to the German Empire in exchange for peace. To an American public, already tired of the war by this point, this might sound acceptable. Now, despite all of this, I still don't think the Democrats are destined to win this election. Roosevelt absolutely still has a chance, and if he does win, we transition to a version of the optimistic scenario which I will discuss later. But in the worst case, which we will focus on for now, the Democrats clinch 1916. Roosevelt is heartbroken and doesn't hide his disappointment. The former president spends the rest of the conflict publicly criticizing the new Democratic president. It matters little. As he enters office, the Democratic president starts reaching out first to their allies and then to the Germans, seeking a route to compromise. American forces in Europe are ordered to defend, not attack, preventing most further casualties. Plans are made, but not immediately put into effect, to downscale American presence on the continent again. But the Americans do ensure that France and Britain are informed and take over any position that they abandon. The Germans are enthusiastic, never having been closer to a significant victory than now. The Democratic president starts openly probing the Germans about what they might desire in case of a peace, and what they might be willing to give up. Many Americans, but especially Wilson, greatly disliked Tsarist Russia. It is not unthinkable that the US starts pressing for a deal that basically abandons Russia in exchange for peace. And with the threat of American soldiers leaving the continent, and even potentially American loans and material aid stopping, the Americans may just convince London and Paris to accept a deal which, for example, returns all or most German colonies in return to Alsace to France, while an independent Poland, which in reality would be a German puppet, is created, with potentially Lithuania and Kurland falling under German influence too, and Austria being satisfied with Serbia and Montenegro. It should be clear that, even if called compromise, such a treaty would essentially just be a German victory. But to the American president and public, that was fine. In their mind, they minimized human suffering by ending the deadliest conflict in history. And really, Germany was the one doing the concessions, as they were occupying their enemies. Of course, this would leave Europe greatly destabilized. Berlin would now be able to solidify their influence in a straight line down to the oil of the Middle East. Russia, meanwhile, has a complete crisis of confidence as trust in the West is gone. The Tsar's position would be near completely undermined, very possibly setting up for a collapse of Russia, which would only further bolster the German position in the East, and would basically remove any threat to Germany's new position. Such an outcome to the war in Europe would, in my opinion, be a very valid outcome if Roosevelt forces the issue of war too early. Now alternatively, and arguably more realistically, the peace talks fail. The Entente pretend to be interested, but secretly try to sabotage, but more importantly, the Germans just fail to read the room, and simply demand far too much while refusing to make significant concessions themselves. Specifically, only a month after the Democratic president took office, the February Revolution would rock Russia, and it is very possible that the German High Command, seeing the Americans as uninterested in the war and the Russians on the brink of collapse, simply think that a peace deal now would be unwise, as if they fight on for just a couple months longer, they might yet achieve a total victory. With peace talks abandoned, I would imagine the Americans committing to the status quo. I don't think they take the effort to actually leave the war. They just don't actually do that much. They withdraw from Europe, slowly and orderly, ensuring the Germans don't suddenly break through empty lines. Yet still, millions of soldiers are leaving the Entente side, and where in this alternate 1916 the Entente had outnumbered the Germans, this would be reversing again in 1917. It is even possible the numbers are worse than in our timeline, as Germany pulled more forces from the east, while the French and the British may have lost more soldiers in offensives while feeling confident with the Americans around. Or they might have moved more soldiers to other front lines. Thus, 1917 would be a very depressing year for the Entente. The Americans are scaling back their involvement, Russia has had 2 revolutions, one in February and another one in October, making it very clear that soon the Eastern Front will be fully resolved. The Entente are indebted to the American government, and if the American president so chooses, money flows could soon stop. Aside from a minor pause around the American election, submarines have been operating at full capacity for the entire duration of the war, and now the Germans were starting to line up for their final offensive on the Western Front, which, with the food situation on the continent deteriorating, will still be their final shot at success. By now, a German victory does start to look at least plausible, especially since not just Russia, but also America leaving the war could significantly demoralize the Entente population. You might be familiar with the French mutiny against offensives on the Western Front. They might likewise happen here, further crippling Entente abilities to counterattack at all. It would now be a simple matter of who blinks first. German victory is not guaranteed. The British blockade still has its intended effect of starving out Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Ottomans were underrun in the Middle East, and a Greek entry into the war could threaten to blow open the Balkan front. Best case for the Entente, they hold the line in a nerve-wracking final confrontation on the Western Front, after which the German allies begin to surrender one by one, starting from the south, leading into the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, culminating with the German Revolution ending the conflict fully. The war was too close for comfort, but the Germans were still brought to heel. In such a world, we would broadly return to our own timeline in Europe, except that Wilson wouldn't be taken seriously by the Entente. His 14 points, if he does still write them, are only taken seriously in the context of how they can benefit the major Entente powers. I would expect we could see a harsher treaty against the Germans, as the Entente realized they cannot rely on the Americans in any future conflict. Meanwhile, areas which historically got a plebiscite over their future, as part of Wilson's self-determination scheme, might in this timeline be given wholesale to Poland, with especially the loss of Silesia being a potential heavy blow to the German industry. In such a world, cross-Atlantic relations would likely be significantly worse in the decades following the war, and this will have further effects on the interwar too, as America won't be as involved in the peace process, cannot as easily respond to the Ruhr occupation or mediate German reparation payments. We might also never get a Dawes plan to revitalize the German economy. This alternate Germany might therefore have an even more depressing interwar ahead of it, unable to restore their economy in the late 20s as they did historically. Very possibly, the political future of Germany is changed altogether, and perhaps they are even so weak that their warmongering is checked in time, before it can get out of hand. But if anything like World War II still happens, we need to hope that we still have a figure like FDR in the White House. But considering we have likely butterflied away the entire political history of America, that is far from guaranteed. Beyond that, this war would leave far more of a distinct mark on the US. This is not just the conflict that they wrote in on at the end to save Europe, but they too have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of casualties. Very possibly, the Americans are even more isolationist going forward, and the jubilance of the Roaring Twenties may very well be dampened. The future of such a world is left up in the air. Now alternatively, usually I don't put much stock in the final, desperate spring offensive by the Germans, but this just may be a scenario where it has a chance to undermine the Entente positions. Not necessarily reaching Paris, but doing enough to spook the French and the British, who are now faced with a collapsed Russia, an America on the retreat, and economic troubles. If the Germans are lucky, such a show of force might mean the Entente are ready to sue for peace, as the American president arbitrates the peace conference. Germany couldn't push too hard, but they don't have to. At the start of the war, the Germans had broad goals to expand in Western Europe, but in our timeline, after they achieved their victory in the East, they moderated their ambitions on this front. Many in the high command were fine giving up on Western gains, potentially even giving up Alsace, so long as their reorganized East was legitimized. A German victory in this manner could see them retreating from Belgium and France, but Eastern Europe and the Balkan would be given to the Central Powers. Possibly, the Germans even give up some of their colonies in exchange. Somehow, while on the brink of starvation, the Germans have still achieved a victory. They would be in a tight spot, as they would have to contend with the communist, nationalist, and independent movements of Eastern Europe, which could very well drag them into another conflict, where despite German military supremacy, such an intervention could run the risk of further boosting support for the Reds, while conducting this war would be difficult in the context of resistance from occupied territories. Other issues also persist, like Germany having cannibalized their own economy for the war, and their political system having been turned into a military dictatorship. Even after victory, the situation in Germany would hardly be stable, and the occupations would be costly. It will be an open question if the German leadership succeeds in stabilizing their situation, and avert a democratic or socialist revolt which still simmers at home. Yet, if they do, their situation is now very powerful. Of course, their former allies are also potential liabilities, most notably the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which even in victory remains the weakest link amongst the Central Powers, and the new emperor will have a difficult route ahead of him in reforming his empire, with especially the Hungarians always being a difficult sticking point, perhaps the most likely cause for a new conflict. Despite being weakened, the former Entente would remain close together in a formal alliance aimed at countering any future German aggression, or even striking themselves if a significant opportunity presents itself. In Italy, a new brand of ultranationalism was already taking shape, which in this timeline is focused on only a single objective: the destruction of the Habsburg Empire. Europe is in the hands of the Germans, and time will tell if they can hold it, and one can only wonder if the democratic president who caused this all truly believes that what they did was right. But let's go back in time, and instead explore some optimistic timeline, wherein Teddy gets the outcome he deserves for his brave intervention. Following the Black Tom explosion, he succeeds in whipping up support for war. Yet again, for about a year little happens, as the Americans are simply busy mobilizing their forces, and Roosevelt, now with the threat of American forces moving to Europe, attempts once more to get the Germans to surrender. Entente's morale skyrockets as more soldiers, more money, and more ships are available for the war effort. A couple of months after the declaration, the election of 1916 occurs, but the Republicans clinch another victory, either setting Roosevelt up for his fourth term in office, or Roosevelt picked another pro-war, progressive Republican who can succeed him. Now the main question becomes, does Germany surrender soon after? With the threat of American troops in the west, while the Russians are still fighting in the east, it is not impossible that morale amongst the Central Powers significantly decreases. Yet, the time for an early peace would be narrow. Again, in February, the Russians had their first revolution, and if the Germans hadn't yet surrendered by this point, once again, the German leadership might delude themselves into thinking that, despite America's entry into the war, there would still be a chance of overall victory by using eastern resources and entrenching in the west until the west just gets tired. If I had to guess, the Germans would continue to fight until the bitter end, but as usual, let's at least briefly discuss both options. So, what if the Germans just surrendered shortly after Roosevelt entered the war, while the Russians hadn't yet collapsed? A version of this timeline could also be achieved if the Republicans won the 1916 election after declaring over the Lusitania. In either case, the Germans, or perhaps some of their allies, might realize that the jig is up. For example, something like the Sixtus affair, wherein the Austrians attempted an end to this conflict, might be successful, which undeniably would then domino into an overall end to the war. In either case, the Germans would now be faced with lessened peace treaties, most notably by reducing war reparations and army restrictions, while the most likely territorial losses would be Alsace and Posen for the Germans, and Austria would lose Bosnia, Galicia, and territories to Italy. Germany also loses near all of their colonies. The Ottomans, assuming they aren't sold out by their allies, actually hadn't faced that many losses in the Middle East yet, and might make it out of the war in relatively good condition. Of course, this could be a rather interesting post-war world. In Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, the monarchy survived to sign the peace deal. Yet in all three of these states, their regimes would have grown unstable from the hardships of war. There is a good case to be made for political instability in all three of these nations. Russia still has a decent chance for at least their Republican revolution, but quite plausibly, the Bolshevik one is held off. Still, this revolution would be coupled with at least a Finnish declaration of independence, as they were still in a personal union, but likely also a Polish one, and a general collapse of the Russian Empire would still be in the cards, especially if the Western Entente stopped caring about allying with and supporting the autocratic Russians. Eastern Europe is a very likely source for instability in this new world. Austria-Hungary also likely sees issues, most notably since it's the Austrians who face the brunt of the losses in this peace deal. The Hungarians, on and off striving for their independence for centuries, could possibly now seize the chance to further their independence, or at the very least, move the center of power within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hungary could easily block any sense of reform, at least within their half of the empire. Even if the Habsburgs officially hold on, they would no longer be a real great power in the post-war world. In Germany, while their path to ultranationalism is avoided, or at the very least seriously altered, we must also contend with the fact that Germany survives as a significantly more powerful nation, and their elites would remain unchanged, committed to advancing German interests on the world stage by violence if necessary. Especially with a collapsing Russia and Austria, Germany could seek to reassert their position. So, plenty of tension points would remain in such a timeline, with most notably whether or not the Russian Empire can find stability being a real sticking point in the question of whether this continent is headed towards a new period of chaos, or if some new balance of power can be forged, one that prevents the continent being thrown into the whims of communism and ultranationalism. This might be one of the most optimistic versions of a Teddy 1912 scenario. But going back in time yet again, what if the Germans just keep fighting? Emboldened by the February Revolution in Russia, the war just continues to drag into 1918 anyways. Remember, more American soldiers don't immediately translate into massive military breakthroughs in the trench warfare era. Still, the collapse of the Central Powers cannot be denied, at which point the main question becomes, would Roosevelt and Wilson handle the peace process differently? This question goes a lot further than just the borders that come out of the negotiation, as arguably it's more important how peace is achieved in the first place. In our timeline, after the German Revolution, the Entente accepted a ceasefire that led into peace negotiations. Yet, by the time of this surrender, the German military was still intact and the Entente were not in Germany yet. This was something that Roosevelt criticized Wilson for, as he argued that the Entente should have continued the war until the Germans didn't just agree to a ceasefire, but they surrendered unconditionally. While it is possible that such a policy could, at least partially, extend the duration of the war, it would also lead to the German people seeing the full collapse of the Western Front, and major cities falling under direct Entente occupation. While this wouldn't necessarily take the revanchism out of the major German figures, this would make it significantly harder for the stab in the back myth to gain prominence amongst the wider public. It might even strengthen Weimar's legitimacy post-war, as it would be far more difficult to argue that they should have just continued the war and refused the Versailles Diktat. More than any border change, war reparation or army restriction, this undeniable military defeat and potential broad-scale nationwide occupations might cement in the minds of the Germans that what had happened was a failure of their once proud military, and perhaps a new course was needed for the nation. Beyond that then, did Wilson and Roosevelt actually differ significantly in how they'd act in a peace conference? Well, yeah, absolutely. Most notably, Roosevelt was less of an idealist, and he wouldn't come to Europe with a grandiose 14 points or rigid ideas of national self-determination. Roosevelt might have a more cold and calculating attitude towards peace in Europe, and he is likely more inclined to work with the major Entente powers, while Wilson was famously difficult to deal with, the UK Prime Minister quipping that he had done quite well at the conference, considering he was seated between Jesus Christ and Napoleon, President Wilson and Prime Minister Clemenceau respectively. I would expect that, during this peace conference, Roosevelt would defer much more to his European allies than Wilson did, rather than singularly attempting to dominate the peace talks. as I might imagine Roosevelt mostly aligning behind Britain's moderate views of what a post-war world might look like. But of course, there are many things that Roosevelt simply has no control over. Poland had been created by the Germans during the war, and we already saw pro-Polish revolts across the Central Powers. The Russian Civil War had already kicked off, so Eastern Europe was in chaos, and there was little the Entente could do to change this directly. Many figures, including Roosevelt, initially were interested in saving the Austro-Hungarian Empire for the sake of European balance. But it would be too late. Their collapse had come from within, and beyond specific border changes, it just couldn't be reversed. Thus, I don't really think the borders of Eastern Europe would be all too different. Though, keep a pin on the Russian Civil War, we will come back to it later. Minor border changes are possible, but I doubt Roosevelt is passionate about something like Austrian Sudetenland. Likewise, Roosevelt isn't going to be meddling in the Ottoman peace deal in a major way. That then mostly leaves to German peace. How is Roosevelt going to position himself in this matter? Well, I see no reasons for lenience, as all the common territorial goals are likely still accomplished. Everybody was in favor of France getting Alsace, while the expansions of Poland were mostly based on self-determination. Again, eras like Poznan even liberating themselves, while other territories were crucial to the self-sufficiency of the state, like safe access to the sea. Once more, I see no reason to change these facts. If anything, I think it's very possible that things like plebiscites over territories to determine their future don't happen without Wilson, and Germany might end up being just a bit smaller than historically, potentially even losing significant industrial territories like Silesia to Poland or the Saarland to France. As we start to reckon with such a post-war world, there are a couple things to consider in the short and long term. Short term, we have the Russian Civil War. Long term, how does Germany handle their loss in this timeline? And how well does the West safeguard the new world order they are creating? Importantly here, people love to rile against Wilsonian interventionism. The idea that intervening to safeguard democracy is a valuable goal. Well, I am not convinced that Roosevelt doesn't start a similar precedent. He was even more eager to intervene in Europe, although his motivations were more imperialistic in nature, as in showing American power globally, which I am not convinced necessarily sets a better precedent. He had also mused about a more direct intervention into the Mexican Civil War of our timeline, and in fact, ever since 1905, he had very publicly advocated a League to Enforce Peace, which was essentially just his version of a League of Nations. Importantly, this version of an international league called on the great powers, which were bent on keeping the peace, which would essentially just be the Entente by the end of World War I, to essentially act as the global police to safeguard peace. And unlike the League of Nations of our timeline, this league was meant to have actual authority to intervene, by force if they thought it necessary, against potential disturbers of this peace. Of course, it is not guaranteed that he actually gets this off the ground internationally, let alone him convincing Congress to sign up to it. But if actually implemented, it would be unparalleled in terms of a global peacekeeping force, quite possibly more suited to deal with the potential threats of a post-World War I world. If he succeeds though, the first test would be the Russian Civil War. Roosevelt was strongly anti-Bolshevik, even as World War I was ongoing, calling them the worst foes of liberty and democracy. Unfortunately, I still doubt that this would translate into an actual strong enough intervention to win the Whites the war. French and British soldiers in the limited interventions of our timeline physically mutinied. Europe was simply too exhausted, and I doubt even Roosevelt could get Congress to sign off on hundreds of thousands of American boys flooding into Siberia to make the difference, especially as the 1920 election would already be on the horizon. Also important to note, Roosevelt historically died in 1919, but his declining health was partially caused by an illness caught on an expedition in South America. Obviously, as a president, he wouldn't be able to go on this expedition, So it's an open question if the president would actually die, or if his presence continues to loom largely over the Republican Party and America at large. Safe to say, I think a lot of the fate of the world will depend on the United States. How does their political sphere develop from this point? Do the Democrats, after 24 years of Republican rule, finally get their lucky break? Or does Roosevelt's enduring popularity keep the Republicans in power? Does he succeed in transforming the Republican Party into the party of progressivism? Or do the conservatives strike back after he leaves office? Importantly, it is very likely that after Roosevelt's 3 or 4 terms in office, a constitutional amendment would be introduced, barring presidents from running more than twice. This way, a future FDR type would be completely impossible. In fact, a young Franklin Roosevelt got his big break into politics directly thanks to President Wilson, and he may not even be a major figure in politics in this alternate timeline. Another thing to consider is that the Roaring Twenties may well be changed by Roosevelt's policies, possibly damping the stock market bubble leading into the collapse, potentially weakening the effects of the Great Depression. Alternatively, the social programs which Roosevelt championed might ensure the government already has way more measures in place to make the Depression a less significant burden on the population. If the Great Depression is indeed lessened, or perhaps just not as global, this could have massive effects on the politics of Germany and Japan, and in what way those states try to leave their marks upon the world. Safe to say, American politics are completely upset, and this could have ripple effects around the world. Beyond that, in this timeline, America would have actually been involved in the war for years, and therefore, once again, this would leave a far more heavy burden upon the American public. They would have far more veterans of the war, far more deaths, far more casualties. Again, the population could be far more shell-shocked in such a world. Thus, from this point, I will leave the future of this scenario up in the air. If Roosevelt is successful in his League of Peace, this would make it significantly more difficult for the peace in the world to be challenged by rogue powers. But then again, if the Americans would turn to isolationism, the League would hardly be as successful as our own League of Nations. Perhaps, best case, the Great Depression is not quite as depressing, and France, Britain and the US successfully cooperate in keeping the peace, countering any threat to the global order, whether they be communists or ultranationalists. Perhaps worst case, the League of Peace fails, and the Americans go back to an even worse isolationism, after which point, while the details will be completely altered, we might still get into a conflict in the coming decades. The only question would be, who instigates it? Either way, Teddy will have changed our world in countless ways, and whether or not the chips fall to the right side remains to be seen. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.